comfortable.
Okay.
Relax.
I'll try. I'll get into it. It just
Sure.
it'll take a little
initial,
while.
yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I did drive by the church on Friday just to make sure I could find it here,
good.
but I have not ever been inside. It's a nice church.
Yes, it is. It is.
It's,
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's start.
Mm-hmm.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Dear Mr. Schander, thank you very much for coming.
Well, this has been a pleasure.
Yes. You may remember that about 2 or 3 years ago when I interviewed your wife, April, I also invited you, and I was quite persistent that you said no. And now I understand why. Because you have so much to share. It was not time enough with your wife. I look at that and I know a little bit about what you are going to share with us. Thank you very much. Your family name shows your German origins.
Yes.
Share a little bit about that with us.
Well, the Schander name depends on who you're talking to, what it means. The official German surname dictionary says that a Schander is a resident of the village of Schandau, or Bad Schandau, which is on the Elbe River. Schande is a German word which kind of means tragedy or disaster or something like that. And there are some Jews that have the name Schander, apparently assigned because they annoyed the people who were assigning names. and apparently also...
It was kind of punishment.
A kind of punishment, yes. If you were nice to the person, you got a name like Gold or Silber or something like that. But if you weren't, then you got a name like Schander. I have traced my ancestry back. My parents or my grandparents, 3 of them were born in Russia. And one of them was my mother's mother, was born coming to America from Russia, so she is a citizen of the Atlantic Ocean, I guess. and I've actually seen the ship's papers where she shows up as an addition on the records.
Interesting.
My ancestors went to Russia at the invitation of Catherine the Great in the late 1760s, as they were invited and told they could do anything, but they became farmers. And so 3 of my grandparents have roots in the Volga region around Saratov. And my grandmother that was born in the Atlantic Ocean, her parents were from the Black Sea area around, and actually perhaps not all that far from Romania.
Yeah, sure.
I haven't actually looked on a map to be exactly sure.
Yes.
But then the villages on the Volga became crowded, and many people went to other places in Russia trying to find land. So both of my grandfathers spent time in the Caucasus, in a village called Karlsruhe.
Interesting. Karlsruhe.
Yes, and there were several Karlsruhes around. This one was a fairly small village. And I've got to stop and think just a little bit. My dad's father, Friedrich Schander, was drafted into the Russian army. One of the privileges that supposedly had been granted to the Germans when they went to Russia was the freedom from conscription. And that freedom was declared, although it was originally supposed to have been forever, it wound up being 100 years. And so my grandfather was one of the first people that was conscripted. My understanding is that he went to was in the army, went through basic training, came back, and and basically went AWOL, left without leave, and came to America and arrived in North Dakota in April of 1899. My understanding is that he was an Adventist when he came.
Really?
I have spent some time trying to figure out just all the sequence of events that were there. I don't know much more than that right now. I just know that he was, my dad reports that he was an Adventist when he came.
Originally, the Germans
he
were
would have
Lutherans.
My ancestors all came from Lutheran stock.
Yes,
there also
yes.
were Catholic settlements that were on both the Volga and on the
there are
Black
also
Sea.
Catholic settlements.
And there were Mennonite settlements.
Oh.
And there were some Reformed churches.
Calvinistic.
Yes, and they tended to be by the Russian army or the Russian government lumped them together. So if you were Protestant, you pretty much went in the same villages, and some had maybe more Catholic, or I'm sorry, more Reformed than others, and some had more Lutherans. But I have been able to trace my ancestors back to the very first Schander that went to Russia in 1767. And it's kind of an interesting story. I have some baptismal records. There was an Anna Katarina, who was a daughter of Martin and Ophelia. And she lived maybe 2 or 3 months and died. And then there was a second Anna Katarina born, and I followed her on the records, and as the family went to Russia, I can see that she made it to Russia, but did not make it to the final settlement. So someplace between getting to Russia near St. Petersburg and finally arriving on the Volga, she died. There were a fairly substantial number of the original settlers that died in that process. It was 10 or 15 or 20% sometimes. So it was kind of a tough time. And I have also looked at Schander. One of the nice things about having an unusual last name is that you get lots of hits when you Google things that are relevant as opposed to ones that aren't. And it's possible that some Schanders were Huguenots. I've just some vague hints that that's a possibility. I don't know beyond that for sure, but there are Schanders that go back before the early 1700s, which is where I've confirmed my ancestry.
Very interesting. Why were you so thorough in investigating your roots?
My wife tells me that I'm a concrete random. I do detail things and I'll just jump off on something else. And so it's just been fascinating to learn about this. And my dad had done some work.
Really?
And when he basically gave me his files, and I've kind of continued that.
I see. Do you have any idea how your grandfather became an Adventist?
I do not know. What I do know is that there was a fairly substantial pietistic stream in many of the Lutheran villages. And in some cases it was just a little bit, in some cases it was a little bit more. But that stream of belief seemed to permeate things, and I think that what happened, and I should kind of come to this in just a minute, the willingness to do that, I think, tilled the ground that was necessary. And when Adventism came, the ground was tilled because of that, and it took root. There is a person at the Friedenau Seminary in Germany,
yes.
which is where the Adventist archives are.
Yes.
His name is Daniel Heinz.
Yes, I interviewed him for this
Okay,
program.
well, he's working on a biography of Conradi. And at this point, we don't know that if Conradi ever made it to the village in the Caucasus where my grandfather was, but it's at least conceivable. And this book, which I have here, kind of talks about the Adventism in the Dakotas. Many of the settlers in both North and South Dakota were Black Sea Germans. And there was one of the persons, it says the unlikeliest missionary was Philip Reiswig. He had heard about Adventism in the late 1880s, became an Adventist in South Dakota, and decided that he wanted to go back to Russia to spread the word. And he had, let's see, there was several things. He was the most unlikely missionary because he was 67 years old, almost blind, and handicapped by a speech impediment. And so what he did was take a trunk of literature with him. He would go into a village, sit down at the town square, and have a tract in his hand. And as people went by, he would say, "Can you read this for me?" And so they would read it. And if they were at all interested, he would give them the tract. And if not, he would keep it and do it for somebody else. And he apparently managed to kind of tap into this stream of pietistic thing. And some of them were called Stundists, which was kind of Stunde would be a German word for hour, and kind of meant that you spent a little bit of time. This stream was also in some of the Ukrainians. I have a friend whose grandfather came to, again, North Dakota as Ukrainians rather than Germans, but they were Stundists. And many of these people that were involved with the Stundists, if they became Adventists once they arrived in the Dakotas, that was a real substantial field that people were able to come to, and the villages, there were several places in North Dakota that had Adventists kind of gathered there, and the people that were selling land or giving land out. A lot of land was available to the railroad companies, and they would sell it for settlers, and they kind of tended to group people together. So there is a band of German settlers that goes all the way east to west across North Dakota. North of that, there's a band of Ukrainian settlers, and they would group even people a little bit by religion. So where my grandfather settled in North Dakota, there were a substantial number of Adventists around there.
Before we go further, it's very interesting for our Romanian side, because some of the first Adventists to come to Romania were actually German from Russia who became persecuted in Crimea and around the Black Sea, and they found refuge on the Black Sea shores in Romania, very close to the city of Constanța, Romania, and there they founded the first Adventist church, still in function in our days.
Thank Philip Reiswig.
Yeah.
I mean, I, from what I'm reading here and what you're telling me, I think that Philip Reiswig may well have been the person that, in some ways, put the original seed in the ground. Conradi may have helped with that, and other people. There has been a lot of back and forth between the people that left Russia and went to North America. My dad had some uncles that were in Argentina. And they wrote back and forth, and some of these other things here, some of the letters that I have are
So
people
returning
talking.
to North Dakota, and that was the place where you were born?
I was not born in North Dakota.
No.
Both of my parents were born in North Dakota. My dad became an Adventist minister. The family story is that he used to teach the cows or preach to the cows when he was young and had to watch them. But he became a Adventist minister. He went to Union College, and then...
Excuse me, do you think they had classes in German at that time of the year, or they had to follow the
there
English?
Had been a German seminary in Missouri someplace but that had, by the time my dad was in college, it was in English. And Union College served a substantial number of Dakotas, Nebraska, and things like that. And by the time English had become spoken, and I think many immigrants have this problem. My mother reports that her parents spoke German to them, the kids spoke English back. In my dad's family, he did not learn German or speak English until he went to grade school. He learned English in school. It was just a little more tightly coherent community there.
So your father became a minister?
He became a minister. He was starting his ministry in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was assisting in an effort that Elder Eckenroth was doing in the 1945, and I was born in Minneapolis.
I see.
So after that, he went to a place in northern Minnesota called Aiken, which is way up in the cold weather area. I'm told that I've lived through 50 degree below zero temperatures, but I don't remember them. And then he moved to another district in Brainerd, North Minnesota. And then we moved to a village or a small community in South Dakota called Bowdle. And Bowdle had a fairly substantial Adventist community. The neighbors, the landlord that we rented the house from, he had a couple of daughters that were missionaries. One was missionary to India, one was a missionary in Pakistan, another one was a missionary to Ethiopia.
Fantastic.
And I can remember them occasionally coming home. They would come home, every 5 years or something, and I think I saw both of them during one of their furloughs. And I know that it's been a while, so the last name was Binder, B-I-N-D-E-R, and one was Alma, and I think she was the one that had gone to Ethiopia. She knew Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia, and I think that he even gave her a set of gold earrings, which she never wore.
Very interesting.
And I kind of having grown up in Bowdle, I was there. I started just a little before I started school, and then we continued. After my third grade, we moved to a different city. But I kind of regard that as my hometown.
I see.
And that was as much as anything would have been like the village or the communities that my parents grew up in. One of the interesting things, and I have a letter here that was in a German language newspaper that circulated into the immigrant community. And there was somebody said that I had 2 of my neighbors became Adventists, and they listed the names of the neighbors. And the town, they gave the name as Tolston, but I think it was actually Tolstoy. And my father had that church as part of the district with Bowdle. So I kind of, and I believe the son or grandson of this person that became an Adventist there knew my cousin who lives in Lincoln, Nebraska, and every time he sees her, he says that my dad was the best minister he ever had.
Interesting. What are your own memories of the ministry of your father? Sometimes did you join him in visitation?
I was the scientific person in the family, and I wasn't sure I could be as good as my dad. So I've had, I've watched my dad. It was very nice having a very good minister always available, because he moved with us. But I have had a chance to just watch what the ministry looks like from somewhat from the outside, but very close to it. And as a preacher's kid, you've probably heard stories about them. Some of them are better than others. I was able to avoid most of the bad things that preachers' kids get into. It took me, it was a little bit of work, it took some time just to realize that that was not what I wanted to do. But it's interesting to just see how the things that ministers have, and I've kind of watched other people do it, and the challenges are much the same, just dealing with people in a way that has to be sympathetic, and yet can't be completely just buddies kind of thing. You're a little bit separate. So I've enjoyed that. My brother became an Adventist minister.
Really? So that was your family? Two brothers? Or
there were, and I have two sisters.
And two sisters as well.
I was the oldest. My brother was the second oldest. And then I had a sister. Her husband, she became a nurse. And right now her husband is the CEO of Kettering Health Network in Dayton, Ohio. And my other sister, the youngest one, was just here recently for some meetings. She is the Children's Ministries Coordinator for Northern California Conference. So we haven't strayed very far from the surroundings of the church.
Yes. Did you like, or did you resent moving with your father from place to place? Or both?
I never liked moving. I still don't like moving. But I usually got used to it after it happened. And one of the things that I learned, because we moved around, my dad had a little bit of the wanderlust that I think that brought his father and mother to the United States. So we didn't move within conferences. We moved between conferences almost. So my dad was in Minnesota, South Dakota. Then we moved to Indiana, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Ontario, Canada.
Oh man!
And then I was old enough to leave, and so I didn't continue on. But then he moved to Tennessee and Seattle, Washington.
Back to the west.
And then to Kelowna, British Columbia. And I think that he retired there, but he wasn't quite ready to retire, so he went to a little village in Nova Scotia. And it turned out that my brother had the adjoining district, and so my dad and my brother were able to work together for several years.
Fantastic. So, give us some glimpses into the life of those old German Adventist churches and communities.
There, I'll have to talk mostly about Bautel, because that's kind of the one I grew up in. I'm a little bit less aware of some of the other ones. I'm somewhat aware, but they were, by the time I came around, the German language was pretty well something that only, there was a few old people that had German Sabbath school class. So it was no longer done in German. Part of that was because the Germans had 2 world wars under their belts by then, and there were a lot of people did not want to do certain kinds of things.
I can imagine, yeah.
But it was interesting. I do know that when I went to visit my grandparents, and my dad's father died before I was born, so I never saw him. But when we got ready to leave, and we always had kind of a family goodbye prayer, and it was always spoken in German. If you needed to speak to God, you had to speak in German. That was the impression that I got as a small child. But they were, we're talking about farming communities, and people came together from farms, and we would, I know in Bautel, we would go off every Sabbath. It seemed like there was somebody invited us out, and I think I could probably count on one hand the number of times that we had Sabbath dinner at home in 4 years, and it was great. I enjoyed climbing in haymows. I enjoyed walking in fields. I enjoyed doing all the things that kids do, and of course then there were chores. I mean, you gathered eggs, you pitched silage down for the cows, you did all kinds of things. I can remember one time standing in the middle of the winter on top of an open-topped silo, and it looked like I could almost touch the stars from there. At night, as we were shoveling silage down for the cows, and most of the families had a few cows. My uncle, who was my mother's youngest brother, inherited the family farm, and he had cows for a while, and then he finally got rid of them. And he said, the problem with cows is that no matter how good a job you do milking cows in the morning, you have to milk them at night too. Yes. and they're just, it's a constant kind of thing.
Yes.
And but I enjoyed being in these communities, and they were. There was some German, that was there. We had all kinds of German delicacies, dill pickles that are better than you can ever buy anywhere else. Things like that, sauerkraut.
Yeah, sauerkraut, yeah.
And other things too. But and some of that's just growing up in a rural environment too. And just.
So can you think on some core life values, life principles, which in a way shaped your character, your personality, your approach to life, you can attribute to the German roots?
I have a hard time that's not the way my mind works in terms of things. I kind of discover that, that's the way it is, but after it's all happened, as opposed to I need to do that because that's the way things are. I have been I think I've learned to respect people that have to work with their hands. Even though most of my life I didn't have to work with my hands, I worked with my head. But people there that have to work with their hands can be just as smart as people that have to work with their heads. They use a different part of their of things, but it's important to do that. And I will admit that I'm proud of my ancestry, having seen the hard work that people have done. I don't think it would be any different than other immigrant communities. One of the things I have learned by going through this kind of stuff is that the immigrants came here because they thought things were better than where they were, but they weren't all that wonderful. They worked hard, and there were lots of things.
Hardships.
There were lots of hardships, yes. And they were, my dad can remember his mother coming back from Jamestown, which is one of the larger towns in North Dakota, and reporting that she'd been called dirty Russian by people that were the kids that were there. I've read stories about people who were cheated. One of the letters that I have here was written by a man. I don't know whether he ever became an Adventist, although I think he did. I know that his son was an Adventist. In fact, his son was a missionary to Brazil. I've been able to track that down in the Adventist archives and draft records and things like that. But he was, this man had been a grain buyer in Russia. And my experience growing up with farmers is that farmers know to within a half a bushel how much grain they can put in a truck or a wagon or anything like that. They just look at it and they know what it is. And this man was selling his first load of flax, his first crop he got after he moved here in 1900 or something like that. And he took it in to the grain buyer, and the grain buyer told him that how much it was and paid him for it. And later he realized that he had cheated him about 20%. And he was able to do it because in Russia they used a different unit. In the United States you measured grain in bushels. Over there you measured it in pud. And so I'm sure he knew exactly how much he had in pud, but he didn't know how much he had in bushels, and he was able to be cheated that way. He said he went back and had somebody that spoke better English than he did trying to convince the man to pay him more, but it didn't work. So,
yeah, it was hard.
It was hard, yeah, and we cannot ignore the fact that the people that came, my ancestors, other ancestors, were really had to work very hard. We see much the same kind of thing, I think, with the Hispanics, which are very common around here. They do the menial chores because they're willing to do it. Yeah. They think it's better.
They have no other choice.
They have no other choice. Yeah. But even so, they made the choice to come here deciding that it was better than where they were. Yeah. And I know, go ahead.
No.
There, some of the letters that I have.
Yes, let's speak for the next few minutes about some of those letters. Because you came interested in letters. They were actually letters to a journal, to a newspaper.
Yes.
Yeah?
These letters were written by the immigrants to newspapers that circulated among the immigrant community. And there were two that I have a fair number of letters from. Both of them were published in the Dakotas, One was published in Yankton, South Dakota. It's called Der Freie Presse, or the Free Press.
Yes.
And the other one was Der Staatsanzeiger, which is a daily bugle or something like that, or which was published in North Dakota. And these letters were a little bit like what Facebook is for us now. It was a way to, you wrote a letter to the newspaper, and everybody that got the newspaper could read it. And in my family's case, there were people on 3 continents. My dad had uncles in Russia, in North America, and in South America. And I have letters that were written kind of back and forth to those. And so there was news, but the important thing was the letters. And I have gotten letters that they were written in German. Some have been translated by other people. I have translated a few of them. They were written, the ones I've collected, all are by people that had some relationship to the village of Karlsruhe in the Caucasus. And I have letters from about 1910, actually some of them even a little before that, all the way to the early 30s. And there's reports of initial coming over here, reports on World War I, reports on the famine that existed in Russia after World War I, all the way up to the beginning of collectivization in the 1930s. And some of them, I only have the original facsimile of the newspaper.
Yes.
Other ones I have that have been translated. But
share with us some of those insights and those.
I'm going to just do 2 that I translated. Excuse me. These were written by my grandfather to Der Freie Presse, or Dakota Freie Presse, and my grandfather's first wife died about 1909, and these letters were written during the time between when his first wife had died and before he married his second wife, which would have been my dad's mother. And so he says, "Today I'm ordering the newspaper for my brother Heinrich Schander." This was his brother that remained back in Karlsruhe. And I'm going to take an opportunity to write a few words for the paper. I send the paper to my brother because the people in the Caucasus want to hear more from us and read the Free Press. And since so many in North Dakota are from the Caucasus, and this paper is the best paper for the German Russians, I will gladly read the reports from the Volga district, which is where they actually originally came from, since that is where I was born. I'm glad that we have such a good paper and therefore send it to my brother. Then he talks a little bit about the weather. All farmers talk about the weather and the crops and things like that. Then he says, I have heard that our 3 brothers emigrated, but still do not know where. I heard once that they had gone to Brazil and South America. If anybody knows where they have gone, please send me the address. And now it turned out they went to Argentina. But at the time that he wrote this, obviously he didn't know. And we live in a world where there is constant communication. We know immediately what's happening. Here we're talking about it would take months sometimes for information to get there. The story is that these brothers, when they came, may have had something that would have prevented them from coming to the United States. There was an eye disease called trachoma that many immigrants had, and it's possible that they went to Argentina because there was a little bit less strict on enforcing that. But I have letters, I don't have any of them right now, but I have some that I accumulated that came from my dad's uncles in Argentina, and they communicated back and forth. This Heinrich Schander that was my dad's uncle that remained there. I have some other letters later on from after World War I where he talks about things. And let me read the second letter from my grandfather here. And he says, "For 6 months I have subscribed my brother in Russia to the Dakota Free Press because I love to read news from the old homeland, and I hope that he would at least send 2 reports to the paper. But the subscription expired and I've heard nothing from him. If he wants something in the future, I'll send it to him, but he has to write first." Then there's kind of other little things here. Winter arrived, there's plenty of snow. Again, farmers always talk about that kind of stuff. One of the things I've learned in these letters is that leaving was not always something that people wanted to do. I mean, you gave up the companionship. When you left to go, you may well be saying goodbye to somebody for the rest of your life.
Sure. Absolutely.
With no, very little hope of doing anything more than that. And there were people that stayed there. I'm going to jump ahead to some stories about World War I that are here. And once in a while, before I go on to that, once in a while people actually sent pictures into the paper. And this was a picture of the Andreas Schmidt. He was the guy that was rooked out of his flax money because by the things. And he's telling him about how he came here. And he says that for the first couple of years, his wife kept trying to convince him to go back to Russia. And he didn't do that, but it was...
Yeah, quite a discussion.
It was a discussion. There was a person that remained in Karlsruhe by the name of Jakob Sommerfeld, who knew both of my grandfathers and occasionally refers to them in letters. But he's writing to somebody that was in the U.S. that was very close to where my grandfather was living. And he said, and this was a private letter that was written to his brother-in-law. And he said that, I'm going to kind of get in here, "I and my family are healthy enough, but we are very, very sad. Our only son, Gustav, was inducted into military service in August 1915. On August 25, 1916, he was heavily wounded, and on November 6, he died in Erzurum in Turkey. Both of his legs had been smashed, and he could not be healed. This was a heavy blow to us. Everything we had in the world is now gone. We are living as if in a dream, forsaken by God and man. My dear friends, how difficult these times are. Would that they came to an end. Thousands of our brethren are now resting in their cold graves, and only God knows how long this will last. I write this letter with many tears, and who knows how many more we'll have to shed. We are living miserably and with great sadness. I'm about to lose my mind. You ask yourself, is there still a God? Or is mankind so hated by him? Why did he create them if he does not wish to preserve them? Must this tremendous bloodshed be? You begin to wonder. And this is a very sad time, obviously, for this. And he was writing to a family member. It turned out that the person that he was writing to submitted it to the paper because there was not very much news. With the onset of World War I, news from Russia just stopped. And this letter was printed in 1917.
So it was not meant for the newspaper.
It was not meant for the news.
It was turned to the newspaper,
But there is another letter, and this one was printed in 1920. It was actually written in 1919, almost a year before it was printed. And this one was intended to go to the paper.
Mm-hmm.
And so he tells much the same thing, but with a little bit more professional detachment than he had in the other one. He says, my only son Gustav had to give his life during the war in Turkey. Both of his legs were shattered, and thus he was brought into the military hospital in Eretsum, where he had to lie for another 2 months and 11 days in most intense pain before death released him from his frightful suffering. How I would have loved to visit him in the hospital, but driving there during wartime was prohibited.
Very different.
It's completely different. And then he's talking about the Russian Revolution. What we have gone through in these past 5 years is indescribable. While the war was going on, it was still tolerable, but it was the revolution that killed us. The Reds took everything they wanted. Locks were broken, and even the tiles were taken from the roofs. Everything needed for farming, horses, wagons, and harnesses were simply taken. Beef, cattle, and poultry were slaughtered. Thousands of sheep were slaughtered. The Reds lived like wild animals and not humans. I lost everything. 1,000-fold thanks to the Cossacks who kicked the Reds out of our village on January 4 and also drove the gangs out of the neighboring villages. Many thousands of Reds lost their lives. The people are seated here rather thin because those that weren't killed by disease starved to death. I mean, it's a
fascinating, from someone who was there.
And then I got a letter from, this one is from Heinrich Schander, the person that we talked about earlier. Beloved Brother Friedrich, it will make me happy if when you get this letter you are in good health. We are, God be thanked, all well. It is already a number of years that we have heard nothing from each other. So no doubt, dear brother, you are curious how things are going with us. Now, if you only look at one side, things could be worse. We have not yet been brought to hunger. We still have enough clothing. For this privilege and others that we have previously enjoyed, we must thank God. On the other hand, we have endured many difficulties during the past 7 years. In particular, after the war came to our doorstep, we had to quarter soldiers and care for the sick, wounded, and dying. Then came typhus, which in our village claimed 200 lives. Hardly a household was spared, and many families were entirely wiped out. My wife also died, and we all remain sickly, so that one can barely help another.
It's interesting how he mentions his wife down there.
Yeah.
Or you put that in the first line.
Yes.
But he created the whole context. And by the way, my wife also died.
Yes.
It's almost very, very different, yeah.
And then he says here, they're talking about the planting. If the good Lord does not take pity on us soon, we will have no need to put machinery into the fields. Then we will have a bad winter coming, and we can expect hunger to move in with us. I have often regretted not having gone to America. And then he talks, says, people have, there's David Axt, one of the persons that he knew, spent 3 years on the Turkish front. In winter it was bitterly cold, and he and the others have returned from that hell don't just have gray hair, it is entirely white. And then he says something about Andreas Schmidt, the person I kind of briefly talked to about and he talks about some of the tragedies that went on and how very much he would like to be able to come, if even possible. He says, I can still work, but at this point there was no hope of him coming.
Sure.
And this letter, even though it was addressed to my grandfather, was submitted to the paper by Andreas Schmidt, who was the relative here. And I have one more letter that came from another person. This was from a fellow by the name of Karl Grabinski, and he talks a little bit more about the same thing. And it turned out that the person that submitted this letter was Carl Geyer, who was my dad's neighbor. The Geyers and the Schanders lived, probably as close as many houses were on the prairie. They lived within 100 yards or so of each other.
Oh.
So there was a property boundary between them, but their houses were close.
Very close.
And I can imagine that these two letters may have been on the same kitchen table at one time.
That's fascinating. Well, our time is almost up. You didn't expect that. So those letters open fascinating windows into the history of the German Americans, German American Adventists,
Yes.
and your own, family. But you have also another window towards those times. Briefly, let's speak about those hymns you became interested. And they also have their own stories, and they give us a glimpse into the psyche of those generations.
Okay. Well, one of the things that, even though I have almost no musical ability, for some reason I have come to enjoy or appreciate what are called shape note hymns.
Yes. We'll show a picture of that. Yeah.
They're shape notes because instead of having the little round things that all notes are in music, they have different shapes, and people learn to sing by knowing the shape sounds, and just like we do do, re, mi, they would do fa, sol, la.
Yeah.
And the shape note tradition started in New England in the 1700s, and people would come in to music school in the wintertime, learn how to sing, and then they needed hymnals to do that. And so I have just kind of gotten interested in it. The tradition, after it died in New England, because people thought that it wasn't good music, I shouldn't say good music, it was music that didn't follow the established norms. It gradually moved south, and people still sing from some of these hymnals, although they've been modified a little bit.
You have selected a few of them.
Yes.
Let's mention them, and we'll briefly listen to the opening bars.
I'm going to start with one that is kind of I like the tune on this one. It's called Mercy's Free. What's this that in my soul is rising? Is it grace? Is it grace? Which makes me keep for mercy crying? Is it grace? Is it grace? This work that's in my soul begun, it makes me strive all sin to shun. It plants my soul beneath the sun. Mercy's free. Mercy's free.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
And then I have another one that is called Jesus Christ the Apple Tree.
Apple tree, interesting.
Which compares Jesus to an apple tree. And in New England and many places, apples
including Romania,
were an important...
The main fruit.
It was the main fruit. And so this one, the original, and I've done a little bit more research than I talked to you last. This was actually the tune was originally, I think, a march. And it was borrowed to a religious purpose, and now we don't remember the original use of it, but we can still have that.
So share a few lines from the words. Yeah.
Let's see here. This is. For the tree of life my soul has seen, laden with fruit and always green. The trees of nature fruitless be compared with Jesus Christ, the apple tree. This beauty all things doth excel. By faith I know that, but ne'er can tell. This beauty doth all things excel. By faith I know, but ne'er can tell. The glory which I now can see in Jesus Christ, the apple tree. And it kind of goes on there. It's a very interesting way of comparing
Wonderful.
that.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, the
yeah.
other thing I want to talk about, which are early Adventist hymns. And early Adventist hymns sprung from much the same tradition. It was a little bit, wasn't quite in the flowering of this tradition, but many of them are still that way. And one of them, which is, you tell me, is in the Romanian hymnal.
Yes.
Which is I Saw One Weary by Annie Smith.
Mm-hmm.
Annie Smith was the brother of Uriah Smith. And she wrote this poem, and people believe that it's referring to several pioneers in the Adventist church. I saw one weary, sad and torn, with eager steps press on the way, who long the hallowed cross had borne, still looking for the promised day. Well, many a line of grief and care upon his brow were furrowed there. I asked what buoyed his spirits up. Oh, this, said he, the blessed hope. And that one was regarded to be Joseph Bates.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next one was regarded to be James White.
Right.
And the third one, some people say was J.N. Andrews, but there are those that believe that this was actually autobiographical, and it was Annie Smith was referring to herself, although she in the poem used the word he to refer to it.
Yeah.
But as you listen to the music, you're going to notice on the third stanza that the women's section sing that part.
Oh, yeah. Like old-time painters, they had a way of hiding themselves there.
Yes. And the last one is What Heavenly Music. And I'm not quite sure why I like this one, but I think that I like it because my dad's younger brother was into speech, and he died very young. He had colon cancer and died when I was still in grade, we were still living in Bowdle, so I was 7 or 8 years old. But he left to my dad a wire recorder. This was a tape recorder that was on wire. That was a generation before tape recorders. And I recall that there was some music that I'm assuming was the Union College Choir singing What Heavenly Music. And so I just kind of enjoy that, partly because it's a chance to remember this.
Yes.
This is in the U.S. hymnal, but is not in the
I don't think it's
not in the
Romanian.
Romanian hymnal. The original words were found in a book that James White put together, I think, in 1849. So it was very early on.
Very early, yeah.
It was there was no tunes in the book; it was just hymns. So there was just words. What heavenly music! What heavenly music steals over the sea, entrancing the senses like sweet melody. 'Tis the voice of angels borne soft on the air. For me they are singing, their welcome I hear.
Wonderful.
And it kind of goes on that way.
Yes, I think that brings a very appropriate conclusion to our conversation. There would be many, I know a little bit, our viewers don't know, there will be many other topics we could discuss together. Unfortunately, on this occasion, our time is over. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
It was a very intriguing and fascinating, expedition, I could say, in the past history. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. I know it was
56 minutes.
Wow.